And I hope you had a chance to listen to last night's recording, because we did cover a lot of ground just with the first few verses of Vayera, because I wanted you to see the repetition of the word for seeing, so that you could see, not just see it, but so that you could understand it. That's one of the meanings of see. It means not just to look at or to appear or to be aware of. It means also to understand what you're seeing. So the doubling down there of that particular word as it appeared early in the Torah portion was so that we could understand that Abraham both saw the angels and he understood why they were there. He understood that he was having a spiritual encounter, not just a physical encounter. Obviously, he responds in a physical way with hospitality. That's normal. When we encounter the supernatural, we tend to respond with physical things because that's what we're conditioned to do. And I don't know if it ever occurs to Abraham that if they are angels, then they don't need food. But he says something interesting to them. He says, I want to bring you bread to nourish your heart, not to nourish your body, but to nourish your heart. So there's an understanding there that they're on some sort of important mission that has to do with him. And so he gives this appropriate response of hospitality. And we're warned that we need to be careful, because we might be entertaining angels and not be aware of it. And the other important point I wanted you to see is that so much activity is taking place at the opening of the tents. And we spent a lot of time last night going through 2 Corinthians chapters 4 and 5, because Paul is basically making this homily about the Torah portion. He's hitting the highlights, talking about resurrection and so forth, and the difference between what is mortal and what is immortal, and life, being swallowed up in life or being swallowed up in death, those sorts of things. And this is definitely a resurrection portion. It's saturated with resurrection pictures, even down to the angel saying, because the English translations just don't pull out what the angel is saying. He's saying at this time next year, he says, there will be life. There will be life. Chaya. You know that word. Chaya, or chai, means life. And that's what the angel's saying. There will be life. There will be resurrection. And it's not just of Sarah's womb, because he says, return. I will return. There's going to be 2 returnings that he's talking about. And in those returnings, there will be life. So it is prophecy of the resurrection. And the idea that Abraham is at the opening of his tent tells us something. And that's why we read those passages in Corinthians. He's telling us that he has an awareness of the supernatural. He knows that he's not relegated only to this physical earth, that there is another part of him. There is a spiritual part of him. We function in the physical realm, but if we ever forget, like Paul says, that the decay of the body is only an illusion, it's a deception to distract us from the renewing of the inner person that's occurring. So every day when you look in the mirror and it looks saggier and baggier, the reality is it's getting softer and prettier. It's getting fresher. It's getting younger and younger and younger. And throughout Scripture, you will see sometimes the symbol of the youth. Youth, Y-O-U-T-H, youth. Whether it's a male or female. That's very important because, again, it's giving us resurrection pictures. What will we look like when we're resurrected? Well, we know from Yeshua's example, sometimes we're going to be hard to recognize by people who know us. But the understanding, too, is that we will have a more youthful appearance. And that's going to be embedded in something that Sarah says as we go through the lesson today. She's going to give us a hint as to what our resurrected body might be like. And the good news is we don't have to use skin products anymore. We'll save a lot of money in the kingdom because we won't be drying out the way that we are right now. But that characterizes our lives. And Paul talks about this body as a tent. A tent is a temporary dwelling. And at the moment we forget this body is a tent and it's only temporary to help us prepare for our spiritual afterlife, then we're making a mistake. We're cultivating things that are perishable, that will decay, that will be swallowed up in death and decay, instead of making the preparation, even in this tent of our body, our physical body, for a resurrection where the spiritual is going to join with that which is resurrected in the physical realm. And that's going to distinguish us in some ways even from angelic beings. Our bodies, when they are restored, are going to be pretty primo things, pretty cool things to be restored to. So let me pull up the PowerPoint. And we'll slide through some of these real fast. This is where we were looking at the repetition there of the words for seeing, where he didn't just lift up his eyes and see, he saw prophetically and he understood. And let's see. Talking again about a person who has the spirit of Adonai. We looked at the symbol of the tree, and we looked at the symbol of the arets, or the earth, because Abraham bows, it says, down to the earth when he sees these angels, and he seems to be responding to one specific angel. And we could probably debate back and forth whether that was pre-incarnate Yeshua, was it Michael, who was that particular angel, because he didn't reject this particular reaction of Abraham. But we went through the seven spirits of Adonai to show the pattern there from the creation gospel. And we went through at length Paul's teaching on the topic, which brings us to is it there? No. Maybe it was here. I think this is where we stopped last night. We're in the text of Genesis 18:10. The angel is speaking, and he repeats, and that's where the little red arrows are. He said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And she was listening at the tent door. There again is that tent opening. So Sarah is going to be at a tent opening, which tells you that she does have an expectation that something spiritual is happening. And then when it happens, it scares her. How many of us are like that? We pray and we pray and we pray. And then when he gives us what we want, it scares us. We weren't ready for it. But she's listening at the door. That's going to be important because Abraham has seen. And now Sarah is going to hear. So it says she was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. In other words, behind the angel. And so breaking down the Hebrew text, you can see the two red arrows pointing out that typically our English translations will not accurately translate what the angel actually said. It says, Vayomer shuv ashuv. It's a doubling there of the word for return. He's saying, return, I will return. There are two returns that this angel is talking about, at least two. And he says, and this is where I don't think the English is translating for us very accurately, because we don't see anywhere in the English translation really that he's talking about chaya, which is life. the Hebrew text, it's very specific. Vayomer, and said, Shuv Ashuv, return, I will return, Elecha, to you, Ka'et Chaya. And that's being translated from a Jewish standpoint, that what he's saying is, at this time next year, there will be life. Chaya. And when he says ka'et, it means like a time of life. What is he saying? He's saying, when I return next year, basically all of you will be sound and alive. You'll be healthy and alive when I return. And he doesn't just say Sarah will have a son. If you read it in Hebrew, you can see it. What it says right there is lesoa, ben lesoa. It doesn't mean that Sarah will have a son only. It means that there will be a son for Sarah. He will be for her. And we get this idea of Isaac as a messianic figure, in the same way that we get Yeshua as a messianic figure, well, as the Messiah himself, to his own mother. So when Mary has Yeshua, she just doesn't have a son, she also has a son for her. His work is for her as well. His work is so that she also will be living, so that she also will be sound and alive when he returns. And that's the idea here. It's occurring at Passover, and one of the clues is later on in the text, he will be more specific. He will say, this is a moed. And when I return at this moed, at this feast day, next year. But the other clue is when two of the angels continue on to Sodom, Lot bakes them matzah, unleavened bread, which tells you that they are traveling through Sodom during the days of unleavened bread, which is a great reason for us to keep the Passover and keep our eyes open. All right, we're continuing to look at the text, except this time I'm going to point out a couple of different things. It says that Sarah's tent opening was behind the angel, and the son is going to be for Sarah. But how she's complementing what Abraham has done up to this point, at the beginning of the Torah portion, it says that Abraham saw, and then he saw. And they're saying that means, yes, he lifted his eyes and he saw these angels were from a spiritual realm. And then the next time it says that he saw, it means that he understood, that there was a visitation occurring here. So Abraham saw or understood. What does Sarah do? She's also at the opening of her tent, and guess what? And which I didn't start out with this, but the understanding from the rabbinic viewpoint is that this was going to occur on the third day of Abraham's circumcision. And so he's hurting, and one of the angels, which is believed to be Raphael, the one that rescues Lot, not the one that destroys Sodom, the one that actually rescues Lot, is talked about in the singular once the action starts. So you've got one destroying and one rescuing at the very same time. But it's understood that before Raphael continued on to rescue Lot, that he helped Abraham to heal up. In other words, he didn't have to continue in the pain after the third day, that he actually did give him this life, because Rophe means a healer. So Abraham is going to be healed on a day when he's sitting at the opening of the tent, contemplating, yes, I'm a physical being, but yes, I'm about to have a spiritual intervention that's going to teach me about resurrection, and healing is part of the resurrection. The body is healed, it's made whole. Sarah complements that because she does something different at the opening of her tent. it says shoma'at. And you know shoma'at is just the feminine form of shomea. And when it's in the imperative, we say Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel. Hearing means obeying. Seeing means understanding. So Abraham has seen and understood, and now Sarah hears and she will obey. And both of these actions are going to be initiated while they are sitting in the opening of their tents. What does that mean? Again, the tent is something temporary. This life is temporary. This body is temporary. But it will have eventually a permanent state. So it says, Shoma'at Petach HaOhel. So there's a duplication there of the language, Petach HaOhel, of what it said in the text about Abraham sitting at the opening of the tent. This goes very nicely with what we learned last week from Isaiah, who says, Abraham and Sarah, he was one when I called him. So together, they're taking the understanding and the obedience, and what is going to be birthed out of that? Well, a son, life, resurrection from the dead. It's the same thing when we have a visitation and when we begin to understand the commandment. We say, oh, I get it. He was serious about that. And then we have to do what Sarah did. We have to obey it. So Abraham and Sarah didn't just see, and they didn't just hear. Once the angels left, within 3 months, they had to do something. Because the angel is going to return in 12 months. If there's a 9-month pregnancy, it tells us that in about 3 months, they did more than sit at the doorway of the tent. They had to understand, and then they had to do something in the physical realm. It's the same with us in the commandment. We might see it, and that's the frustration. We have people with us who we think they see it. We think they kind of understand, but then they don't hear it. They don't do it. They don't obey it. So there's a breakdown between their Abraham and their Sarah. They got a marriage problem inside of themselves. So we have to understand resurrection as something to be seen, but also something to be obeyed. You say, well, how can I obey resurrection? That's not really in my hand. Well, part of it is in your hand. Your preparation for it is in your hand. You can understand it all day long, but he gives it to you to see and understand so that you will hear and obey his word, which is your proper preparation for a tent that will not be torn down, for a tent that is not going to be erected with human hands, but with the hand of Adonai, through the agency of Yeshua. And so as we went back to the text, we looked at some of the grammar last night where we understood that it's saying the angels were standing over Abraham. What does that tell us? They're in a higher realm spiritually. They're not just physical beings. They're standing over us. And the same thing is happening to us. Yeshua is still standing over us. He's at the right hand of the Father. And remember the vision of Stephen as he's being stoned? He sees Yeshua, he says, standing at the right hand of the Father. He's standing over us, promising what? Resurrection. And what has Stephen been doing? Preparing for his life through his death. And so, even though Paul says we have this dead skin covering our bodies, everything we do in our body still matters. And so there's a clue as we're reading in the text. It says, when Sarah's responding to what the angel says, it says that when she laughs in the tent, Sometimes we'll see that translated as she laughed in her inward parts. That's not what you laugh with. When you laugh, it's visible. Somebody can see that. They say the grammar, the construct, when we read it, and I think I've transliterated it out there for you. Yeah, I did. Bakirba. It means she's laughing at her inward parts. So let's think. Sarah is 90 years old. She is long into menopause at this point. And she even, makes the comment that even Abraham's old. And so she's laughing, saying, okay, these inward parts of me, this is going to be resurrected. Is this what you're saying? And so here's the text. I wanted you to kind of see how the rabbis are looking at this. And part of this is coming out of Bava Metzia 87a, which is the commentary on this Torah portion. And then Rashi even clarifies, putting the text together. So in Genesis 18:12, our English version says, Sarah laughed to herself. That's how they're trying to explain how she laughed at her insides, saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? The R Scroll translation goes back to the Hebrew words there, and I didn't put arrows on there. No, I didn't put arrows on there. But it's got in parentheses so that you can see how they're translating out these two words, saying that they have a parallel with one another. She's saying, after I have withered, bloti, shall I again have clear skin, edna. And Rashi says this clear skin, this edna, and it should sound to you like Eden, the Garden of Eden. Eden means pleasure, and that's why typically you'll see that translation in English. Shall I have pleasure? Shall I have Edna? Shall I have Eden? And there is a unity that's implied, and I think there's several layers of meaning. I think it is referring to pleasure. I think it's referring to Adam and Eve before sin, to that unity of the relationship where they were one, just like Isaiah says, Abraham and Sarah, who was one when I called him. But Rashi's translating that, excuse me, as not just clear skin, but he says a luster of flesh. In other words, there is going to be a transformation even of her flesh. And again, this is a resurrection passage. If we only read it the way we've always read it, especially reading it in English, we're missing the resurrection aspect of what Sarah is saying at the opening of her tent, where she's contemplating the eternal. She's listening for, she's waiting for a chance to obey. And this is the understanding now, because it's a resurrection passage, that even though something has withered and decayed and died, or it's in the process of decay, through resurrection, it can be given new life, either from a withered and decayed state or even from a dead state. And it can be restored like the skin. She says, am I going to have lustrous skin again, like I was when I was young? And it's from this passage that the rabbis are saying that when you are resurrected, you are returned to your youth. You have a youthful appearance. You're going to have clear lustrous flesh. It's going to be transformed. And I want you to see below T, where she's talking about I'm withered, like my inward parts, my womb, my body itself, they're withered, it's decaying, it's wearing out. She says below T, here's bala, this root word, and it means to wear out, to decay, to waste. And then if you look down here at the bottom, coming out of the Jacenius lexicon, bala, it means to fall or to fall away, to fail. But it also has a meaning, this is interesting, of garments fallen away and torn by use and age. Now, Paul discussed that wearing out of the body in Corinthians 2, 4 through 5. Excuse me, that should be 2 Corinthians, chapters 4 through 5. That's wrong. But we read it last night, and it's on the PowerPoints. If you go back and look at those from last night. But he discussed this wearing out. But I want you to remember a strange thing in the Gospels that nobody has ever explained to me satisfactorily. And I think this passage, this statement that Sarah makes, where she's talking about, okay, Mr. Angel, you said in a year there will be life. Am I going to have lustrous skin? When right now my garment is fallen away. It's torn by use and age. What is she saying? This garment of my physical body is what's decaying. It's wearing out. It's been torn by use and by age. When the soldiers came to arrest Yeshua in the garden, I don't know if you remember this, because it's just like a blip on the screen. And it doesn't seem to have any context whatsoever to anything else that's happening. It says that there is a youth, and somebody grabs his garment and he runs away naked. The end. Odd little thing to put into that garden story. But what does it tell us? It tells us that in Sarah's mind, this garment of the body is already decaying. The garment is falling away because of her age. And the person who can restore this garment is going to have to be Messiah. It's going to have to be supernatural. Remember, she's sitting at the doorway of the tent. She has an expectation of the supernatural. And I think just with that little blip on the screen in the Gospels, it's telling us, it's doing a foreshadowing of the resurrection, because it's a youth, it's a young man. And this is the promise, that Sarah is going to be restored to a youthful appearance. That's what she's asking, because that's her expectation of what resurrection would be. Here's the root where she says Edna, which is some people's names. That's a good name to have, Edna. And it goes back to the Garden of Eden, or pleasure. And it goes back to Adin, which also means voluptuous or sensual. Very pleasurable. Nice to look at. Nice to be around. A pleasure to be around. And here's the way that one of the other sources, and I believe this was actually out of Bava Metzia, they're translating it as, after I am waxed old, below T, which goes back to that garment being worn out by decay and age, she says, shall I have pleasure, Edna? And Rabbi Chisda said, after the skin He's kind of explaining the grammar of it, showing you the parallel grammar. He's saying after the skin had worn out, which is nitbala, and become full of wrinkles, the skin once again became soft, nitaden, and there's that root word there. And her wrinkles smoothed out, and Sarah's beauty returned to its place. And they're saying this describes the process of resurrection. Your youthful beauty, even after you nit bala, you will nit aden. You will go back to the garden. You will go back to that soft, smooth flesh. And it's going to be lustrous. It's going to be clear. It's going to be, cosmetics are always promising us we're going to be, have a glow. All right. They even understand what we remember in spiritual realms, that the skin we used to have in the garden was glowing. It was luminous. It was smooth. It didn't have a spot, and it didn't have a wrinkle. This is why I worry about kids getting tattoos, because we're not supposed to get tattoos. And if your skin is restored to you at the resurrection, will it have to shine around your tattoos? Just something to think about. How much light will come out of you if the tattoo is resurrected with you? I don't know. Let's hope they're not. Because we all do stupid things when we're young, right? Which I don't have a tattoo that I know about. Paul says to the Ephesians, he says, but all things become visible when they are exposed by the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. Well, what is he talking about here? He's talking about resurrection. He says, for this reason, it says, awake, you sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. That's part of the resurrection. When the light of Yeshua shines on us, then it does transform this physical body. And we get that soft, clear skin. We get the skin, like the rabbi says, that doesn't have any wrinkles, doesn't have any spots on it. And so, he says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her with the washing of water with the word. And just remember, the first thing Abraham does is bring water to wash the angel's feet. So there's one of those symbols. He says that he may present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So Paul is preaching unwrinkled bride. He says, so husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. Abraham and Sarah were one when they were called. Eve was Adam's own body when she was built. He says, he who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does for the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's part, our marriage picture is part of that unity of resurrection. Like he said in Isaiah 51:2, look to Abraham your father and to Sarah who gave birth to you in pain, when he was but one. I called him, then I blessed him, and I multiplied him. That's part of the process of that unity. And I wanted to point this out from chapter 18, verse 7, Genesis 18:7. It says, Abraham also ran to the herd and took a tender and a choice calf. And in English, it says, and gave it to the servant, or at least in the NASB. That's a bad translation. The word there is hana'ar, the youth, and he hurried to prepare it. The youth. See, these symbols like the tree and bowing to the earth and the water and so forth, because they stretch all the way back to the creation week, and their themes hold true all the way to the book of Revelation. That's why we need good translations. And if we're not sure about the translation, we need to go get a concordance and look and see what it says. Because the idea that the youths, see, Esther had her young women, Abigail had her young women, Abraham had young men. Remember when he saddled the donkey to take Isaac to Mount Moriah? The young men go with them. So when you see the young women or the young men in the narrative, you know something prophetic is happening. And most likely, you will get a picture of the resurrection. You will get a prophecy of the resurrection. So he didn't just give the calf to a servant to prepare. It says he gave it to the youth. And then the youth hurried to prepare it. Now let's compare that to Mark 16, 5 through 6. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man, a youth, Hana'ar, sitting at the right, wearing a white robe. And they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed." Yeah, you can say it, but it doesn't mean they won't be. He says, "You're looking for Yeshua the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here's the place where they laid him." So this is not a random messenger. For the disciples who know the Torah backward and forward, and they know this is not just simply the servant who is preparing this meal, preparing the calf for the meal for the angels, that he's a sign. Just like the young man having the garment ripped off of him, so that he is naked, right? How did Adam and Eve know they were naked? They could no longer access the spiritual realm of the garden. They dropped down to merely the physical level. And ever after that, they would have to be able to see in a vision, in a dream, through a visitation. It would take that lifting of the eyes, as it says in Scripture, for them to be able to even get an idea of what that spiritual realm was like. So they knew they were naked. So when you see the garments being torn off, that's another clue that something is about to transpire here that could possibly restore humankind to that spiritual level of the lower garden. So here's our young man from the story of Abraham and Sarah and their visitation, and the young man is sitting at the right. Again, it's very prophetic of Yeshua, who sits at the right hand of the Father, and he's wearing a white robe. The idea that the robe has an aspect of righteousness and glory. But also, remember talking about the spacesuit? That if you don't have this robe, then you can't stay in the garden. You just won't last there in your physical body. You either have to have the robe, or you have to be resurrected. I would be interested to know what happened to Enoch and Elijah. Did they have to have a robe or something? In some cases, we see like a coal touched to the lips. There's various things that will happen that will make it possible for you to be there for a short period of time. And, if you're before the heavenly court. But this young man is wearing a white robe. And he's acting like, why are you amazed? He's risen. Why would he expect them not to be amazed? Why would he expect them to already know he has risen? Because they should know the Torah. If you walk into a tomb and Yeshua's not there and you see the youth sitting at the right hand, then you should be getting a clue that something wonderful has happened. That the resurrection, where he says, at this time next year, at the Passover, I will return, I will return, he says, and there will be life. And just to remind you, because I don't think we maybe did this section last night, we did allude to it, where Abraham doesn't say, just let me bring you some bread to eat. We did. I remember the arrows pointing to the word. Where he offers to bring them bread, he says, to nourish your hearts. Not normal bread. He says, I want to bring you bread that will nourish your heart. And if you were to read through the entire chapter of Luke 24, which we don't have time to do, some things would start to stand out to us with the context of the bread that nourishes the heart, Abraham bowing down his face to the arets, to the land, a promise of resurrection to Sarah, where even her skin so soft is not going to be courtesy of Avon calling. It's going to be courtesy of the resurrection of Yeshua. So it says, in this account, he says, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling clothing. And as the women were terrified, it says, and bowed their faces to the ground. They did exactly what Abraham did when he saw the three angels, especially this one angel that is going to have the power to return and bring life back to Sarah's mortal body and bring life back to Abraham's body. In fact, Abraham's body got so much life in it, he remarried after Sarah died and fathered children. That's quite a resurrection for a 100-year-old man. But they bow their faces to the ground, and men said to them, and remember, that's anashim. We had that pointed out on the PowerPoint last night. There were three anashim, three men that stood there. Two went on to Sodom, one to destroy, one to rescue, and one of them just disappears. Perhaps the one who Abraham is addressing as though he is God. He addresses him that way, and again, bows his face to the ground. And in this case, it's two men standing in dazzling clothing. The women bow their faces to the ground, and they say, why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. This is why I think that third angel, that third messenger, was likely pre-incarnate Yeshua. Because these two angels that traveled with him had a specific message and purpose. But when we see these two men again, if it is again, in the garden tomb, they're standing there acting like you should know what's happening right now. In other words, you already have the book this is in. You've already read this book. Why are you amazed? Why are you here in a cemetery looking for the living one? He's not here, but he has risen. Just like that third angel, he disappears from the narrative. Remember the Jewish tradition that Abraham is on the third day of his circumcision. 3 months will elapse, likely, before Sarah conceives, so that when he returns at Passover next year, she will have a son. Also in the Luke narrative, they remind him, it says that on the third day, he'll rise again. There will be a healing, so to speak. And it says, but these words appeared to the disciples as nonsense. They would not believe them. Remember Sarah laughing at her inward parts and saying, really? You're going to make all this live again? Okay. And she laughs. And then they said, why did Sarah laugh? She said, I didn't laugh because it scared her. But it did seem to her as nonsense. But she was wanting to believe. She was wanting to obey, or she wouldn't have been at the tent opening. That's what it means to be at the opening of the tent. It says, but their eyes, remember the disciples walking with Yeshua and not recognizing him, which goes back to you gain a very youthful appearance, a soft, luminous appearance. The disciples who are walking with him, it says their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. They didn't recognize him, and they should have, but they didn't. And so they're explaining this to Yeshua, who's just going along with it. He's like, tell me what happened. And they say, besides all this, it is the third day since these things happened. But also some women among us amazed us when they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. So they're recounting this. Remember, they think it's nonsense. Oh, really? Can you really resurrect this body? The disciples have the same mindset. It's nonsense. How are you going to resurrect this body? So they're saying it's been the third day since these things happened. And they're saying, yes, the women said they saw him, but they just don't believe it. And they're saying they saw a vision of angels, and Yeshua's got to be walking with them saying, good grief. Do you not get what they saw? That they're taking it straight out of Vayera? The whole encounter with the angels, the youth, the two angels, he's giving you every clue. And I guess because the angel wasn't reading from the Torah scroll, they're not putting it together. And we're the same way. We don't put things together until we see, we understand, and we hear, and we obey. And finally, at some point, he'll open our eyes and we'll say, oh my goodness, that was Yeshua the whole time. And I didn't know it. Yeshua was in the Torah the whole time, and I didn't know it. It just seemed like nonsense to me. Also in that passage, it says, some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women also had said. But him they did not see. What kind of seeing are they not seeing? They're not understanding. And Yeshua said to them, O foolish men and slow of heart to believe. See, they had to be like Abraham. They had to see. They had to understand. They had to be like Sarah. See, the women didn't just hide in the house. They went back to the tomb. They didn't get everything. They were still surprised and amazed, but they did something. They obeyed a commandment, which is to take care of the dead. If you don't know what to do, just do a commandment. Just pick one that seems appropriate and do it, and he will meet you where you are with your faith. And they had enough faith to go minister to Yeshua's body in spite of the danger. So they were the first, not just to see, but to hear. And so it says, when Yeshua had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. It was the act of reclining at the table, taking the bread, blessing it, and breaking it, and then giving it to them. And it says, then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. They understood. They had an Abraham moment. It goes back to the meal where Abraham runs in and says, go make bread for these angels because we're about to get a blessing here. He understood something supernatural was about to happen. A blessing was about to happen. And finally, the disciples get it. It says, then their eyes were open and they recognized and they understood who that third angel was, who said, I will be back at Passover and there will be life and we will all be safe and sound when I return. There will be life. Return, I will return, he said. And it says he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us? Remember what Abraham said? I want to bring you bread to nourish your heart. To nourish your heart, not to nourish just the physical body. I want to nourish you spiritually so that you will believe, so that you will lift your eyes, so that you will understand, and so that you will hear what I am saying and obey me. And when that occurs, when you start acting on that faith, there will be life. Return, I will return, and there will be resurrection. And Yeshua is right there saying, I'm back. Return, I did return at the Passover, and there is life. And guess what? I'm not the only one here. You're here too. Like the rabbi said, you will all be safe and sound at this time next year, at the Passover. And it says they began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. Why the bread? Because Abraham said the bread is to nourish your heart, to give you the heart that sees and a hearing heart. That's what King Solomon asked for. He could have asked for anything. And he says, give me a heart that hears. And when we have eyes that see and ears that hear the word, then there's resurrection in our inward parts. There is life. And that's why it's so important to share the breaking of bread with other believers, because there is something supernatural happening in that experience. And it's not we're just sitting there breaking bread. We're talking about the word. And it's in that breaking of bread and talking about the word that he will open our eyes and open our ears to hear even more. It's a beautiful thing. Yeshua says in another place, he says, see my hands and feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see. What is he saying? Not just look. He's saying, understand. I want you to touch me and understand. He says, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. It was exactly like Sarah said. Is my very skin, are my very inward parts, are all the wrinkles going to go away? Is all the decay, all the disease, everything that we're born with as human beings, is all that going to go away so there will be life at this time next year at the Passover? And Yeshua says, yes, understand, look at me, touch me and understand what I have done. And to prove it to him, it says he took fish and he ate it before them. Why would he eat the fish? Why would he break the bread? Because it takes you back to this Torah portion. The angels didn't need to eat bread. They didn't need to eat curds and whey or whatever it was. They didn't need to eat a calf. They're angels. They're spiritual beings. They don't need that kind of food. They have the food of angels. But Abraham says, I'm going to make you something special that's going to nourish your heart. And it says they ate it while he stood nearby under the tree. And Yeshua said, all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. What did he do? He opened their Abraham eyes. so that they could see. Vayera, Vayera. Understand. Don't just look at me, understand me. Understand the process of resurrection. Understand every step that Abraham and Sarah took before you. It was screaming the word resurrection. And so when it ceases to be a story, a fairy tale, a piece of history, the boring end of the Bible, when all of a sudden these words come alive, every single word, when we're motivated enough to go back and look them up in Hebrew, and we see where he says, there will be life. Return, I will return. Oh, are you telling me that even though this garment of my body has decayed, that it's going to be like the Garden of Eden? It's going to be lustrous and luminous, better than, I don't know, L'Oreal, whatever they're selling. Much better, because it's going to be eternal. He says, thus it is written that Christ would suffer and rise again from the dead the third day, and that the repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things, and behold, I am sending forth the promise of my Father upon you. But you are to stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high. Again, even in the Gospels, we don't have random words. So he's reminding them that it's written. It's not just written in the prophets, it's written in the Torah. That Yeshua is going to suffer. Remember Abraham suffering for 3 days in the pain of circumcision. Why? To remove the veil of flesh and to reveal the spiritual. A new elevation in his life, a new level of his faith walk. Suffer and rise. What did Abraham do? He's suffering, but he gets up and he runs to serve. He rises again from the dead. Sarah's body rises again from the dead. And he says, I am sending forth the promise of the Father upon you. I don't know if you remember the grammar we said about the angels. It literally says they were standing on Abraham. The promise was upon him. The strange little grammar things, they mean something. That the blessing, the promise is literally upon you because it's from an elevated realm. It's from a spiritual realm descending upon you in a physical realm. He says, but yes, it's Passover at the resurrection, but it's going to get bigger because the 5th day is also a resurrection day. If you remember, if this is the 3rd day, that it's connected to the 5th day. They both have the same origin. So what's true of the 3rd day is also going to be true of the 5th day. They work together. One's going to be the resurrection of Yeshua. The other one's the resurrection of the greater body of Messiah. He says, and I want you to take this message, he says, but you have to wait until you are clothed with power from on high. He's saying, wait until Shavuot, which is the 4th feast. And then what happens? The 5th feast is Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, the greater resurrection. So he's giving them the progression of things. He's saying on the 3rd day, Feast of First Fruits, during the Passover week. Now you wait until Shavuot so that you will receive this gift of tongues. So this name can be proclaimed to all nations at Shavuot. And when that happens, he says, you're going to be clothed. Remember the clothes. That's part of the message. With power from on high. Well, the 5th spirit of Adonai is Gevurah, which is power. And remember, one of those angels was thought to have been Gabriel. El is my strength. El is my power, Gabriel. And just maybe coincidentally, I'm not sure, Gabriel was the one who was thought to have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and the 4 cities. There were 4 cities total, I think. So the power of God, you've got Raphael, the healing power of God, the rescuing power of God in one angel, but you've got Gabriel, the destructive power of God. If necessary, the other angel. And with the fall feast, we see more of that destructive power in action prophetically. But with Michael, or Michael, the disappearing angel from the Abraham story, his name is who is like El. I think the answer is Yeshua is like El. And there's an interesting midrash. Sometimes, again, you can get these interesting connections and you think, well, maybe this is why Yeshua said this to this group of people, or maybe this is why Paul wrote this. Again, in the same source where it describes Sarah's skin and inward parts being restored, Baba Metzia 87a, it also describes Isaac's weaning celebration and said Sarah had been so resurrected in her body that Abraham invited the kings of the earth to Isaac's weaning celebration and said that the queens brought their nursing infants and said that Sarah nursed them all. Now that's a midrash. You're not expected to take that literally. What it does teach, though, is that to Sarah is given the credit again as being that mother of many nations, just like Abraham was the father of many nations. Being able to nurse those children of the kings of the earth, that's what Yeshua was saying. I need you to go and take this message that I've suffered and I've risen from the dead on the 3rd day, so that we can again take that message to the nations of the earth. It says, and he led them out as far as Bethany, which is Beit Ani, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. Beit Ani is the house of the poor. And from last night, if you'll go back and look at those passages out of Proverbs, it talks about the poor man. And it says the poor man can see through the rich man. Why? Because he sees what the rich man can't see. A person who lives at the opening of their tent, a person who realizes that, yes, I live in a physical mortal body, I live on a physical earth, but my expectation is of that spiritual resurrection that will take place in my body, my literal body, that it will be transformed. When you live that life at the opening of your tent, realizing it's only temporary, you can see through things that other people can't see. They can only see into the physical realm, but you start developing Abraham eyes, and you start developing understanding, and you can see through people. In fact, that's a modern expression. He saw right through it. What did they see? They saw a spiritual reality that wasn't evident only through the physical evidence, the facts, the physical facts. What does the poor man see? He sees life from the dead at Passover. In fact, twice, I believe, Abraham pointed out that the angels had passed over Avar, where we get Ivri, Hebrew. Twice he mentions that. And that's what a Hebrew does. He passes over Avar, the great river, into the lower garden. So the first step on this process is to be poor. And what do we eat? Oh, I thought I put it on there. Maybe I didn't. At Passover, we eat halachma ania. Halachma ania. Halachma ania is the bread of the poor. It's matzah. And when we eat the bread of the poor, according to Proverbs, we are eating spiritual bread that's going to nourish the heart so that we would be able to see through what's happening in physical realms all the way to the spiritual. That it's not just 3 visitors come to dinner, but it's 3 heavenly messengers who are going to bring life to this tent. This temporary tent. There's going to be a restoration. There's going to be a resurrection, so that we can pass over to that lower garden again and get our clothes back. So we don't have to be ashamed. That we'll get those garments of glory back. And let's see, let me stop this. I think that was the end of it. Oh, well, not really. That was from the Haftorah. And what I would want you to do because we did run out of time. And I had asked last night's class to do this, to go back and to read the Haftorah, which is going to be 2 Kings, what was it? Second Kings 4, 1 through 37. But really the part I wanted you to focus on was 2 Kings 4, 8 through 37. And your homework assignment, when you read that Haftorah, I want you to look for parallels. I know we didn't even scratch the surface of Vayera, but I think we got the parts I was looking for, because I wanted you to see how explicit the resurrection is when we start breaking down the words of the text. And so it's no accident that when we get over to the Haftorah, again, it's about the resurrection. The Shunammite woman's son is resurrected. And I want you to look for parallels, but I also want you to look for some differences. There's going to be some differences in there. And I'll point one thing out to you that I would really like for you to see because of the different aspects of resurrection. In the story Vayera, you don't get the same type of picture as you do from the Haftorah, where there's a literal boy or young man, actually a young man who's going to die and who's going to be resurrected. Now the trivia from the rabbinic tradition I want to give you about the son of the Shunammite woman is that they believe it was Jonah. Jonah was the young man who died and who was resurrected. And if that is true, we don't know if it's true or not, but if that is true, how does that transform the way that you're reading Yeshua's words, that no sign will be given this generation except the sign of Jonah? We already know that the book itself is going to give us 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, which maybe not so coincidentally, what was Yeshua eating? Wow. You never know what you'll see out the window when you've got the window open. I mean, it was a hawk like this big going after a rabbit, but he went low. But twice, you see, first Yeshua asks for fish, And then when he meets them up in the Galilee, he's cooking them a breakfast of fish. So when he says the sign of Jonah, and I know in the rabbinic tradition that their expectation or their understanding was that the Shunammite woman's son was Jonah, that gives me an extra layer. Because Yeshua is making a point to break bread, like in the Torah portion, but he's also making a point to eat the fish. The fish doesn't eat Yeshua, Yeshua eats the fish. So keep that in mind while you're reading, and then let me give you this other piece of trivia. I don't know, it's not trivial, but I wanted to read this from Rashi, so that after you read the Haftorah, you can think about this. He says, I think this was my summary, Rashi's midrashic story of the Shunammite contrasts or adds an element of the resurrection. For as Abraham was assured that a son would be given to Sarah at an appointed time the following year, and the message was delivered through an angel of the divine presence, a spiritual being, Elisha points out to the Shunammite woman that he is a man of flesh and blood, and he will die. This is Rashi commenting on Genesis 18:10. What would be the difference that Rashi's pointing out? The one messenger is a supernatural one who's saying that there will be resurrection, there will be life. But Elisha is saying, I am flesh and blood, I'm a human being, and I will die. But I'm telling you, there will be life and there will be resurrection. And there's a slight difference in what is said, because Elisha says to the Shunammite woman, at this appointed time, at this time next year, there will be life. You will be hugging a son. All right? But, and I actually got that backward. I should have moved that there. Got it wrong on my PowerPoint. But the idea that we've got here is that two different pictures. One is a spiritual event, but the other one points out the flesh and blood aspect of the event. Possibly, and you guys can think about this or think of a better way of putting it than I can. With Elisha, we do have flesh and blood. And Yeshua makes a point to point out to the disciples, I want you to touch me. And I want you to understand that I am flesh and blood. I want you to understand your own future resurrection. You can look at me as the model. You're going to replicate this. When you are resurrected, your experience will be similar to mine. Because, like Paul was saying, it's not because we can resurrect ourselves, but it's because of the all-surpassing glory and power of the Holy One. But because of his supernatural power, even people of flesh and blood can be resurrected. I thought that was at least coming from the rabbis, that was an interesting way of looking at that. Because there's a lot of debate out there about, is Yeshua God? What about the Trinity? What about the divine nature of Yeshua? And then from the Jewish viewpoint, how can a human being be God? And to me, it's a mystery. I can't say I understand it completely. And I worry about people who think they do, to be quite honest, because we're told that there is a mystery involved in this. And I don't think until we're resurrected, we'll completely understand it. I think it's something we do accept by faith, that however he's making this work, he's making it work. But the relationship of the Son to the Father, to the Holy Spirit, I've seen a lot of really unfriendly and unkind debates about how those work together and the Trinity. And I choose not to get in those debates. But I think we can accept that we're given hints throughout Scripture that the Messiah is going to come in human flesh, but he will be also divine. That there will be a divine aspect to him. How does that work together? That's the part I don't know. That's the mysterious part, that we can lift our eyes, but maybe that's something that only comes in stages of understanding. And I would rather not understand it and wait and get a better picture of it than make up my mind too soon what it means and then be embarrassed later because I thought I had it all figured out. These disciples were brought up in the Torah and the prophets and the writings, and Yeshua is still calling them fools and slow of understanding. And they've been walking with him and talking with him for probably 3 years. And he's still telling them, you don't understand the resurrection. I'm still having to teach you about the resurrection. And I'm standing here talking to you. And I am resurrected. And you're still not understanding and seeing and hearing and obeying and doing all the things that Abraham and Sarah were trying to tell you you would have to do to get this picture. So if it was difficult for the people that talked to the resurrected Yeshua to figure it out, who are we? You know, I think you can take your time with that step of trying to figure out exactly what Yeshua's nature was. Because in the Haftorah, we see resurrection coming through the agency or the promise of a human being. But the message comes through an angel or a divine being in the Torah portion. And who knows what else is in there if we really start digging. So